News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moskow.
Karen, hopes are building that the U.S. could be close to winding down its war with Iran. Both sides are looking to arrange a second round of peace talks before the 2-week ceasefire ends next week. President Trump told the New York Post it could happen in the next 2 days. He had this to say about the conflict in an interview with Fox Business.
I view it as very close to over. You know what? If I pulled up stakes right now, it would take them 20 years to rebuild that country.
And in another interview with ABC News, President Trump predicted the next 2 days will be amazing. We get more from Bloomberg's Jumana Bersecci in Dubai.
This is just President Trump himself. And I will also remind everybody that the Iranian side haven't actually confirmed anything. They haven't said anything. There are no new updates since the Iranian President Pezeshkian yesterday said that they were inclined to continue with negotiations so long as it's done within, quote unquote, the international framework of law.
Bloomberg's Jumana Bersecci reports in the meantime, the U.S. is enforcing a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz with a dozen ships aimed at curbing Iran's oil exports. Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reports a sanctioned Iranian supertanker broke through the blockade this morning, and an Iraq-bound supertanker sailed into the Gulf through the strait on its second attempt this morning, making it the first crude carrier to make the passage since the blockade went into effect.
Nathan, while the U.S. and Iran are seeking another round of talks, Israel and Lebanon met for the first time in more than 30 years for high-level talks in Washington. Paul Wallace is Bloomberg's managing editor for the Middle East.
These were the first direct talks between Israel and Lebanon since 1993 in more than 3 decades. So that in itself is important. These two countries don't formally recognize each other. Rubio called it historic. That's probably a bit too strong, at least at this stage. But, although not much came out of the talks, there wasn't too much that was negative. They didn't sort of break down. You didn't have the Israelis or the Lebanese saying they were a waste of time or anything like that. So in that sense, it's a baby step.
And Bloomberg's Paul Wallace says Hezbollah, a key player in the conflict, has not been invited to the discussions.
Well, Karen, European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde says the economic crisis brought on by the Iran war means an early exit from her role is not an option. Lagarde spoke with Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix in Washington, where she's attending the IMF spring meetings.
When there is big clouds on the horizon, the captain does not leave the ship. And this captain is not going to leave the ship, because I see clouds.
European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde spoke to Bloomberg as traders bet on 2 full quarter-point rate hikes by the ECB this year. Catch the full conversation on our new video experience on the Bloomberg Business app.
Meanwhile, Nathan, former Treasury Secretary and ex-Fed Chair Janet Yellen says she still sees prospects for a rate cut here in the U.S. later this year. Speaking at the HSBC Global Investment Summit in Hong Kong, Yellen did warn that the oil shock caused by the war in Iran clouds the outlook. Yellen expressed concerns over the Fed's independence under President Trump, saying his calls for lower rates risk undermining the credibility of the nation.
Karen, the current Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, says President Trump's tariffs could be restored by July. Speaking at a Wall Street Journal event, Bessent indicated levies could return to levels that were in place before the Supreme Court struck down many of them.
We had a setback at the Supreme Court in terms of the tariff policy, but we will be implementing or conducting Section 301 studies so that the tariffs could be back in place at the previous level by beginning of July.
That was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent speaking yesterday. After the Supreme Court struck down many of his global tariffs, President Trump imposed a temporary 10% levy that covers many imports. That tariff is due to expire in July.
Well, Nathan, Vice President J.D. Vance is adding to President Trump's criticism of Pope Leo XIV over his opposition to the war with Iran. The American-born pontiff posted on social media last weekend that anyone who follows Christ is, quote, never on the side of those who once wielded the sword and today drop bombs. Vance says he doesn't think those comments are based on theological truth.
I think that it's important, in the same way that it's important for the Vice President of the United States to be careful when I talk about matters of public policy, I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology.
Vice President J.D. Vance is one of the most prominent Catholics in the U.S. He spoke at a Turning Point USA event in Athens, Georgia.
Let's turn to markets now, Karen. Futures are little changed following another day of gains on Wall Street. In fact, the S&P 500 is now trading near all-time highs, and the tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 rose 1.8% for a 10th straight day of gains. That's its longest such streak since 2021.
And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Karen Moskow.
I'm Nathan Hager, and this is Bloomberg.